And now a criticism by a gentleman called Angner. Do I have here something? So that's an article in Philosophy of Science. Philosophy of Science is one of the 2 top journals in philosophy of science. And we'll have also in the next section, we have articles from this journal. So the supposition is, of course, that these are articles of high quality because the journals are very famous. Whether that's really the case, well, sometimes they are. Sometimes they are not. Okay. Angner is an interesting person. He's got a PhD both in economics and in philosophy of science. He's a professor of practical philosophy at Stockholm University. His most important publication is probably a course in behavioral economics. He also wrote a very much discussed article with the title, "We Are All Behavioral Economists by Now." That was discussed. So anyway, he's an interesting guy, and he really knows economics and he knows philosophy. So, what's his criticism of Hausman? The target of Angners' criticism is this. First, Hausman's claim that in economics preferences are and should be comparative evaluations. So he says that's just not the case. That economists use the term preferences in that sense. They don't use them as comparative subjective total evaluation. It's just not true. And the second part of that claim is, and they shouldn't do it. Again, you see the descriptive and the normative. He says Hausman is descriptively false. Economics doesn't work that way. And he is normatively false. They shouldn't do it because it wouldn't be good for economics if economists followed Hausman's advice to use that concept of preferences. The third thing is, and this is again now the positive, he says preferences in economics, a concept or the term, is an undefined primitive in economics. I'm going to tell you more what that is, an undefined primitive. It just has a different function. This word has a different function. And still, Hausman's view of preferences is not just useless. It's an explication of preference. Hausman's explication is only a model for the axiom of preferences. And if you don't know how familiar you are with that talk, when you have an axiom system, this is something what you know. But a model of the axioms is just a case fulfilling the axioms. It's just an example fulfilling the axiom. This is the way how people speak about it. So in that sense, they say, Angner says, yes, it's the case that this explication of preferences fulfills the axioms of preference theory, but it's not a general explication of what preferences are in economics, right? Question? No. Yeah. Next one. All right. So these are the 4 things, and I'm going through these 4 points that you see how Angner argues. Now, the first one was preferences. Angner says preferences in economics are not total comparative evaluations formed in a demanding cognitive process of reflection on partial evaluations. This was the very important point that I told you. You know, this it's very complex, and also Hausman describes it himself that way. That's a very demanding process to make all these, partial evaluations. First, the aspects, you evaluate them, and then you have to aggregate them, and you have to take this external normative constraint. Very complicated. Sometimes you know these complications, sometimes you do not have these complications. Anyway, he knows that. So, and what Angner says, look, if you look how economists really use the concept of preferences, they do not presuppose that preferences are of this nature. They do not do that. And the evidence for that claim is you have to look at the practice of economics, right? He said, and there Angner says, and he writes several pages on that, he says, if you look at prominent textbooks, and you look how is the term preferences introduced there, right? What is the structure of economic theories presented in prominent textbooks? That is not in there. The preferences are used as these subjective, complete comparative evaluations. It's just not there. Also, he looks at the history of economics, and then it's, of course, not very plausible to have such a fat a thick mental concept of preference. If you know the history of economics, that especially in the second part of neoclassical economics, is rather the abstraction from all this mental stuff and all this psychological and complicated, and rather saying, look, we are not interested in the genesis of full preferences. Whereas his model, Hausman's model, is of course a model, a normative model, for the genesis, for the construction of preferences, right, out of the partial evaluations. And then he says, look at economic practice. It's just not the case when you measure preferences that you measure that. Preferences are in these different domains of economics. Preferences are treated, as he puts it, as primitives. Primitives just means undefined, right? A primitive is an undefined. It's not primitive in the sense of primitive, but in the sense of without definition of constituent parts. Primitives explicitly and adamantly rejecting the notion that economics should explain how preferences are formed and why they have the features such as transitivity and completeness. So he says, if you look at the practice and the textbook, then partly explicitly people say, don't ask what preferences are, don't have mental connotations, and they just have transitivity and completeness, and we just presuppose that period. Right? This is what he says if one looks at the practice of economics. And in fact, he says, empirical research suggests that preferences revealed in observed behavior, by choices, are not in general formed in a process of reflection. So very often people have preferences, and it's not that complicated reflection meaning that the main part, of course, being the aggregation, right? The aggregation is the difficult part. The aggregation is not simply an addition because, I mean, you have aspects for the Egypt and Graubünden case. I mean, there are things, the sun is much warmer in Egypt. Oh, I want to go there. And you have something else. Yeah, but the social situation. Oh, and flying, yes. But on the other hand, food is much cheaper. And then, this is complicated and you've got to think of it. And the aggregation is the complicated thing. And then what he says, that there is an empirical research on decision making. And this research suggests, no. Very often people come to decisions in a very different way, right? Not by these complicated reflections, and the reflections do not play a role. So that's the point that why Angners thinks that Hausman is inadequate on the descriptive side, right? Describing how economists in their research practice use preferences. And he says this is not the case, that they use it in the way how Hausman describes the practice. And also, and that's the second and a different sort of argument, they shouldn't do it. It wouldn't do economics very good if they followed Hausman's advice and would change their practice and use preferences in that sense that Hausman recommends. Economists should not accept Hausman's account of preferences as the result of a cognitive demanding process, and that is, so to speak, embedded in the history as it is the 19th century view of preferences, right? It's classical economics. There you were strongly connected with pain and pleasure, and people try to understand in economics what the mental basis of preferences are, and that has been completely abandoned by 20th century economics. So in a sense that Hausman's attempt is not up to the present. It's just not how economists treat preferences. They do something else and they shouldn't do it. Otherwise, they would fall back to the 19th century. And that is not something that should be recommended. That's against the normative suggestion. And now comes the positive. So what are preferences? And Angner gives an answer there. And the answer is, when looking at the practice of economists, then one sees they treat preferences as an undefined primitive, right? As an undefined term. So if you look, for instance, at mathematics, there are certain terms, I mean, many terms are defined in explicit definitions. But in these definitions, you use other terms. And some of them are defined and some of them are somehow not defined. So in any axiomatic system, you have terms that are undefined, right? They cannot be defined because then you define them and then you come back. So for instance, what a map is or relation in mathematics is typically not defined, right? If a set is defined, well, that's already very tricky how to define sets, but the fundamental concepts in mathematics are undefined, right? And it's quite clear this is unavoidable, Because any definition you write down, you must have other terms, and then the question is, where's the definition of those terms? And then you get in a regressus ad infinitum, right? So it can't be that all terms are defined. This is just an illusion. And the point is simply, so one has to accept in mathematics and everywhere else, one has to accept that certain terms are undefined. And the question is then, well, if they are undefined, primitive as they are then called, how does the concept get its meaning, and how is it connected to empirical phenomena, right? So if Angner claims that, if he said, no, preference is undefined, it's a primitive, then of course the next question is, but how do you know what you're talking about, right? Because there's different meanings of preferences. And here is his answers. He says, first of all, in mathematics, the standard view concerning the meanings of primitives occurring in axioms is that the axioms implicitly define them. That's the standard view in mathematics, that you say, okay, what is a natural number? And then you don't get an answer, but, well, to say in explicit terms, but it says everything that fulfills Peano's axioms. Yeah? So you say the axioms implicitly define, they don't give you formally a definition and saying this is a natural number, but you say everything that fulfills the axioms is a natural number. So that's the sort, it's an implicit definition. That's the practice in economics, in mathematics, and of course it's highly plausible that something similar applies to neoclassical economics phase 2, because that was the idea of Samuelson and Neumann, etc., to formalize and axiomatize in that case microeconomics, and then of course it's also consistent then saying yes, and the central terms in there are implicitly defined by the axioms. If you want to understand what these terms mean, look at the axioms, right? So this is Angner's first part. I must have heard that before. Okay, so the same as in natural numbers, it's an element of a set that fulfills Peano's axioms. And this is the standard practice in mathematics, and of course it's quite plausible to extend that to economics there. Preferences are whatever the axioms implicitly say they are. And this is the main question, main answer. But of course, that does tell you, okay, then they fulfill transitivity and completeness and blah, 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 whatever it is. But then you still only know that within that system, and you don't know how the term preferences is then used in order to be applied to empirical situations. So you must know a little more. That's different in pure mathematics, because if you talk about natural numbers, you stay within the axioms, and there is nothing more to say about it, right? And every statement you make must be derived from the axioms, right? And there's no, apart from conventional definitions, so and conventions, but everything comes from the axioms and stay within the axioms. That's of course not the case in economics, because the axioms for preferences, yes, they are important, but somehow they're going to be applied to the real world, right? To the economic world. So there must, on top of these implicitly defined definitions, definition of preferences, there must be some links to the empirical world. They must be given in addition. And this is what Angner then says. In addition, one needs a connection of the implicitly defined preference to empirical phenomenon. And there he says, this is accomplished by so-called correspondent rules that do this job. So correspondent rules, they are the rules how the term preferences, implicitly defined by the axioms, correspond to empirical phenomena. But the important thing is, these correspondence rules are less than a full-fledged definition. That's the point. So a full-fledged definition would tell you which empirical phenomena are preferences, right? But that, he says, no, Angner, that doesn't work that way. You have this implicit definition by the axioms, and then you have correspondence rule that do this job. Here's an example. For preferences, an obvious corresponding rule is if A prefers X to Y, then A will not choose Y when X is available, right? That's, of course, that's obvious. This is what we mean by preferences. But the point is that this rule is too weak to be a definition of preferences, as Hausman, by the way, correctly observed in chapter 3. But it suffices for the application of preference in many contexts. So the fundamental point is, Hausman attempts to define what preferences are, right? What especially traditional philosophers say, okay, if I want to understand something, you've got to define your concepts. So you've got to define what preferences are. And then he gives this definition in terms of total subjective comparative evaluations. Angner says, look, that's the wrong approach. The right approach is to see, first of all, preferences function in an axiomatic system, and there is some kind of implicit definition of preferences by these axioms. And the second step is, because you want to not be and stay in this axiomatic world, but this must make contact to the empirical world, you must tell us by examples or whatever, you must tell us how the term preferences then attaches to phenomena in the real world. And then he says, yes, there are rules for that. They are called correspondence rules. How the term, and it's used within the axioms, corresponds to the real world. But the correspondence rules do not add up to a definition. Right? That's the point. So what Hausman wants, Hausman postulates, so to speak, the existence of a definition, and Angner says that's the wrong approach. That's 19th century. And 20th century and 21st century is, you see them as part of an axiomatic system. They've got an implicit definition, and the connections to the real world are done by correspondence rules. That was all introduced, by the way, correspondence rules and stuff, in the philosophy of physics. Because you have the same problem in physics, there you have theoretical concepts, and then people realized you can't define what an electron is, right? It's just not definable in terms of empirical stuff. And then people said, okay, but there are correspondence rules. So Angner has it from there, and this is his point here. And the fundamental difference is that correspondence rules are less than definitions. And definitions are not necessary. I told you already in the context of Kuhn, that's also part of Kuhn's theory. He says it's just a prejudice of the Western tradition since Socrates until the 1950s. The terms that have a clear meaning also have a definition. Wittgenstein says that's false. Terms may have a clear meaning, but no definition. And this is what Angner uses here implicitly by saying, yes, preferences are used, people know what they are doing, but there is no definition. There are only the axioms and correspondence rules. Okay, so, and the consequence is then that, of course, Hausman's enterprise of defining preferences in whichever way is just wrong-headed. It's just the wrong approach. And that's, of course, probably for many of you, then, whoops, that's surprising, right? Because it's so deep in the Western tradition that it's always legitimate to ask someone who uses a concept, give me a definition. And the point is that is not legitimate, because very often that's, of course, a result, or at least a theory in philosophy of language. There is no definition. You can't find a definition, but you still know how to apply the concept. It works differently by these paradigmatic cases, right? And that's the same here. You learn as an economist how to use the term preferences by examples. You just use it in certain situations. So people teach you, and this is what you all learned in your undergraduate studies and also graduate studies, you are presented examples where you use preference in certain models. And then you learn from these models how you use preference in order to set up the models, right? And then predict choices, future choices. You just learn that by examples. And you don't need it. You don't need a definition for preferences. There may be an intermediary state at the beginning that, preferences, people choose according to preferences, which is, very vague. But what you learn how economists really use preferences once you have digested 15 models and have calculated yourself 15 models. Then you know how economists, and if you do that and your professors say, yes, that's exactly right, and you can publish in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, which is not very common for graduate students, but sometimes it happens, then yes, that's the proof that you know that what preferences are. So that's the point here, and Angner says Hausman's enterprise is wrong-headed. Such theoretical terms like preferences function in science not by definitions, but by various context-dependent correspondence rules. So it really depends in which context to use preference, or in physics, electron, or whatever. And then the correspondence rules are different, and therefore they don't up to a full-fledged definition. That's the point. But that's not that important. The important thing is that Angner says, look, there is no definition. It's wrong-headed to ask for definitions if you want to understand how economists use the term preferences. In general, philosophers trying to define theoretical scientific concepts are on the wrong track. This was an insight in the 1940s, 50s, 60s in philosophy of science, when philosophers of science discovered it's really not possible to define theoretical concepts. It doesn't work, right? It's just not possible. All right? But now there is a limited defense by Angner of Hausman. Namely, he says Hausman has still delivered something useful, namely a model of the axioms. And a model, I told you already, is a concrete example of a concept of preferences that fulfills the axioms. So if you look of a set of total subjective comparative evaluations, that should fulfill the axioms. So it's a model of the axioms. And this is useful. It's an example. And this model then of the axioms, so this particular example of preferences, may have various heuristic, pedagogical, or illustrative functions in economics. So it's something useful, but the claim must be a different one. It must not be the claim that here I, Hausman, have finally explained to you what preferences are in economics and what they should be, but it's rather much smaller, according to Angner. You delivered, Hausman, you delivered a model for the axioms, and that may be quite useful to illustrate something. So the way I used it in Hausman's model of choice, for instance, was just such an illustration, right? It just illustrates how rational decision-making may move, move forward, right? And that may be useful in certain contexts if you want to know how are rational choices done, what are the considerations that come in here. Okay, so this is Angner's criticism, and Hausman, by the way, at this conference 5 or 6 months ago, he commented that Angner got it completely wrong, and so he doesn't buy that. But okay, somewhere I got to stop the discussion. So what you see is, and that is, well, partly interesting and perhaps a little discouraging, that in philosophy of economics, there are deep disagreements about what preferences are in economics. So when the philosophers start talking about that, and you will see that also in the other papers that I gave you as supplementary text, you see that they defend, some defend revealed preference theory, others defend, Angner defends his view that they are theoretical concepts, then Hausman defends that view, and they're all, and they're quarreling, and usually they don't find a consensus. I mean, philosophy, it's almost never there's a consensus. So in philosophy, there are deep disagreements what preferences are. And it seems that many economists don't take notice of these controversies. Not only in economics, by the way, but you have the same in biology, sociology partly, but also in other fields, it's the same. The scientists don't take notice of these controversies usually because in their specific fields, they simply know what they are doing, right? Once you've got a good training, then you don't need a definition and a discussion what preferences are. You just have your examples that you've learned in your training and further articles you read in the good journals, and then you see how people use it, and you just copy that implicitly. There, I think the Kuhnian theory is very good. You learn from the examples, you learn how the concepts are used, and then you apply them yourself, and then usually, if you don't make mistakes, then your colleagues will agree and say, yes, very good model, fantastic. Right, and it can also be that they say, yeah, you misused that's not the concept of preferences, and then it depends whether your colleagues agree or not. You learn something. So the point is simply they simply know what they're doing without a binding definition of preference. Compare Kuhn. And the point of Angner is even worse in some sense. He says, don't even ask the question what preferences are. That's the wrong question. Right? Whereas other philosophers may say, no, that's the most fundamental questions. We've got to know what preferences are, otherwise we don't know what we're talking about. Right? And here the philosophers quarrel, and the economists say, oh, yes, let's do real work. Right? This is part of the game. Happens again and again. The philosophers then don't agree. And then sometimes you may say, whoops, but I would like to know what preferences are, besides that particular application. And then you enter this arena. Okay. All right. The point is that this tension there, or this discussion and these arguments, they do become relevant for economics itself, at least to some degree, when it comes to the tensions between behavior and neuroeconomics on the one hand and neoclassical economics on the other, because they differ in their understanding of preferences. And just in very concise terms, neoclassical economics has this behavioral understanding of preferences, so it's just very, very closely coupled to choices. And the behavioral and neuroeconomists say, no, preferences have something to do with behavior, with mental states, not with mental states, so there are psychological phenomena, and then the neuroeconomists even go further. Yes, and the brain produces them, so the preferences are somehow mapped into the brain, and they come to the fore then in choices, and we neuroeconomists investigate what is the brain activity when it comes to economic behavior, economic choices, right? So there it comes to these conflicts, and we will see that then in the last chapter, that this is an important point of disagreement, and there a difficult question becomes what is the right understanding of preferences for economics. And this is really a debate. So these very orthodox neoclassical economists, they simply dismiss behavioral and neuroeconomics, say this is not economics, it's something else. And it's not useful, right? Therefore, they shouldn't publish in the best journals, right? And that this is a very harsh controversy with big consequences. Okay, we will come back to these questions then in greater detail in section 7 and sections 9. All right. What you take away from that is especially, that concepts in economics and also in other sciences, it's not that simple. What you have as standard teaching in the back of your mind, yes, they are must be well defined, and we must study the definition or something. That is not true, and that's important when it comes to for instance, this central concept of preference. But the same holds, of course, of rationality. So when people tell you, economists or whoever, what rationality is, it's not that simple. It's much more complex, and typically you can only understand these fundamental concepts if you embed them in the concrete research situations and problem-solving situations. Then you understand what the concepts are doing. And the formal definitions that you can write down, well, formal definitions are fine if they're an axiomatic system, but verbal definitions are usually not that important in the sciences. That seems to be a fact. Okay.